Good morning, everyone. This is Tom Tersey, the Maryland School of Sailing and Seamanship, and the subject this morning is docking techniques for single-engine boats with right-hand turning propellers, as you can see on the title screen there. And that's what we'll be talking about for the next hour and a half or so. This is based on the work that we've done at the Maryland School over the past 6 or 7 years with a lot of docking techniques and programs that we've used in our normal training courses, and ASA has adopted this program and made it one of their standards. So what I'd like to talk about with this is basically the techniques for getting boats in and out of slips, and a lot of the theory and the forces that act on a boat. And we will talk about that in some detail. So I'm going to take my screen off, my picture off here. I just wanted to let you see who it is that's talking. And I'm going to go into full screen mode here so you can see that. Now, the basic question is, how do I get that big boat into that little slip? And when you look at this picture, it might give you some idea of what we're talking about with a big boat. However, what we talk about today is going to cover boats from 15 or 20 feet on up to 60 feet, because the principles are basically the same. And what you need to do in docking a boat safely, expeditiously, and without a lot of hassle is to understand the forces that act on a boat, how you can control them, have your other crew members oriented or trained in the procedures that you're going to use, and to have a docking plan. And we're going to talk about all of those things today. Now, we're going to cover a lot of material, and I'd like to just show you a few references, and I'll talk about these more later, or at least the first one. Docking Techniques is the book that Billy just referred to, and this is a training manual that we use in the school. And I'll show you a image of the cover of that at the end of the presentation, and also tell you how you can acquire a copy of that from the school. The point of mentioning it here is that most of the diagrams and procedures that we talk about in today's seminar are covered in detail in that book. So we're going to cover a lot of material today, and if you get kind of overwhelmed and confused, recognize that if you want to go back and refresh your mind on what we talked about, that we covered in detail in that training book. The second reference shown here is Chapman Piloting Seamanship Small Boat Handling, and this is a kind of a classic marine and boating book, and you can get it from most marine stores and chandleries. And then the third image shown here, or the third link shown here, is the animatedknots.com, and I highly recommend this for learning knot tying. And there are certain basic knots that you do need in docking boats, and we'll talk about some of these, but basically go to Animated Knots and you'll see motion pictures basically of the knots being tied. They're really very, very well done. So with that in mind, I'd like to first talk about the theory, and that is the forces that act on a boat. So here's the agenda for today. The theory first, then the mooring arrangements that we'll use in various mooring situations, like in a slip and parallel docking and so forth. And thirdly, the undocking, that is getting away from the dock. And the next one is parallel docking along a pier, then docking bow into a slip, then backing into a slip, and then we'll do a brief summary of what we covered. I'd like to next go into the theory and some of the forces that act on the boat. So the first one to look at is the pivot point, and the pivot point is the point around which a boat turns. When we drive a car, we turn the front wheels and we steer the front of the car. But in a boat, we basically steer the back of the boat. And the boat, when it turns, will turn around the pivot point. The pivot point itself is located roughly at the center of the boat. It's actually at the center of gravity of the boat. When the boat is moving forward, the pivot point moves forward a little bit. When the boat is moving aft, it moves aft a little bit. But for the most part, it's roughly at the center of the boat. And you simply have to recognize the concept that the boat will rotate about some point at its midpoint, and when you steer the boat, you'll be turning the stern, and that in turn will turn the bow. So that's pivot point. The next item is the direction that the propeller turns. And in the very beginning, I mentioned right-hand turning propellers. And if you look at these two diagrams, you'll see in this first diagram, in a headgear, a right-hand turning propeller. This is looking from the stern of the boat, and here's the keel, and here's the propeller. And in a headgear, the propeller is turning to the right, or clockwise. In reverse gear, it's turning to the left, and that's a right-hand turning propeller. Okay. Now this has significance when we get to some other items and the techniques that we use. But let's go on to the next concept, which is prop wash. And prop wash is like the air coming off of a fan. If you stand in front of a fan, it blows air in your face. And that's akin to the prop wash. So the prop wash is the water flow coming off the propeller. And in forward gear, it is the prop wash is flowing aft. And in reaction to that, the boat moves forward. In reverse gear, the prop wash is flowing forward, and the boat moves to the stern. Now notice here in the forward gear, the prop wash flows over the rudder. And in reverse gear, the prop wash does not flow over the rudder. So that makes a difference in some of the controls that we use. Now this is the configuration that we have in most boats. And I'm not talking here with outboards or special marine drives, but I'm talking about a rather conventional arrangement with propeller and rudder in this arrangement, which is what you normally have on most boats. The next concept is rudder control of the prop wash. Now you recall that the prop wash in forward gear is flowing aft, so that when we turn the rudder, if you look at the solid figure here, that's a boat facing in this direction, and the rudder is turned to the right, and the prop wash coming off the prop is deflected to the right. The result of that is that the stern of the boat will move to the left and rotate about its pivot point as a result of the reaction to this prop wash being deflected. If we turn the rudder in the other direction, the prop wash will flow to the left and the stern of the boat will turn to the right. Okay, so that's how you control the prop wash in forward gear. In reverse gear, there is essentially no control of the prop wash. Then there's a concept of prop walk, and in this, with a right-hand turning propeller, if we are in reverse gear, as shown here, this is kind of like a rototiller, a garden rototiller, digging through the dirt. And as you dig through the dirt with a rototiller, the blades on the bottom dig into the dirt and pull you along with that rototiller as they dig in. The propeller on a boat is essentially the same as that the blades on the bottom, when they're at the bottom of their arc, they're more efficient in working against the water. So therefore they pull the stern of the boat to the left or to port. The blade that's on the top is less efficient, and it does not have the effect of countering that pull to the left. So prop walk with a right-hand turning propeller in forward gear, when it's in reverse, will pull the stern to the left. Okay, so prop walk is to the left is the thing to remember in reverse gear. All right, the next item shown is turning arc. So this shows two diagrams of two different boats, and the one on the right has right rudder, and if you are going forward, the boat is going to follow an arc to the right, And if you go astern, the boat is still going to follow an arc to the right. So basically, the boat will follow an arc to the right, either in forward or reverse, when you have right rudder. In left rudder, a similar thing. It will follow an arc to the left. That's discounting any conditions of wind effect or acting on the boat. Then this shows a comparison between tiller versus wheel steering. In both cases, we're steering the rudder to the right, but in order to accomplish that with a steering wheel, we had to turn the wheel to the right in order to turn the rudder to the right. However, with a tiller, we have to push the tiller left in order to turn the rudder to the right. Okay? So if I say right rudder, with a tiller, you push the stern to the left. But right rudder with a wheel, you turn the wheel to the right, just like you do in a car. You would be steering the boat in that manner. Okay, now this shows the effects of wind on a boat. A crosswind generally will blow most boats bow down with the wind. And that's because the drag on the underbody of the boat is greater below the water, and the drag on the rigging and the furled sails is greater forward in the boat. So the result of those two effects are to turn the bow downwind with a crosswind. And the next shows the effects of current, and essentially that's going to move the entire boat. It's going to just transfer it down current. Oops, excuse me. Sorry. Okay, the next item I want to mention is momentum, and that is, it's related to the weight of the boat. The heavier the boat, the greater the momentum of the boat. And the momentum basically resists changes in speed. So if a heavy boat will coast longer when it's moving, or it will take more power to speed it up. And a lighter boat will do the opposite. It'll coast a shorter distance and it will take less power to speed it up. You may be going faster than you think, and a lot of times in docking situations we say at certain points come to a complete stop. And you look around you and you think you're stopped, but if you look down at the bubbles in the water next to the boat, you'll see that the boat may still be moving along much more rapidly than you think it is. So check with the bubbles in the water. Throttle speeds, and these are somewhat arbitrary, but it's just to give you a concept of the kind of speeds, engine speeds, that we might be talking about. With a diesel engine in a boat, let's say a sailboat of about 30 feet in length, you'll generally have, for slow speed, you'll have the engine at about 800 RPM, at half speed ahead about 1500 RPM, and full throttle ahead about 3000 RPM. The reverse numbers are similar. Now, a term called throttle kicks, and when we're doing our docking, there are certain times when we have to kick the engine and kick it hard or kick it not as hard. And a kick ahead refers to full throttle ahead for about 3 seconds. And a lot of times people are hesitant about going up to full throttle, but you have that momentum, that inertia of the boat, and you're trying to change its direction or change your boat speed, and there are certain times when you have to really pour the coals to it and kick it hard. You kick it in the butt. So full ahead for 3 seconds is a kick ahead. A short kick ahead would be half speed ahead for 1 second, just a short burst for a second. And the astern kicks are similar, kick astern and short kick astern. So we use that terminology in our docking procedures, and when we're talking to each other, when we're doing a docking maneuver. Kick it ahead, or give it a short kick ahead. And these are things to remember in that regard. Now rudder position, again, this is somewhat arbitrary, and this is based on a wheel on the rudder, which is from stop to stop on the wheel about 1.5 turns, which is about the average for most boats, 1.5 to 2 turns. But basically, right rudder, you turn the wheel a little bit to the right. Half right rudder, turn the wheel about 1/3 turn to the right. And full right rudder, turn the wheel to the stop, which is about 3/4 of a turn. And left rudder would be similar. Now, as I say, if you can't remember all these things I'm going through, they are covered in our docking manual. The next item I want to talk about, this is the first of our procedures that I want to present to you. And a standing turn turns the boat in a confined area. And this is an essential maneuver to understand and to be able to do, because when you're in and around docks, going down a fairway between slips of boats, and a lot of times you have to turn the boat fully around within that narrow fairway, it's a standing turn that you use to accomplish this. And it can only be done to the right with a right-hand turning propeller. It will not work to the left with a right-hand turning propeller. If you have a boat which has a left-hand turning propeller, you would then do your standing turn in the left direction. But again, most boats have right-hand turning propellers, and we would do a standing turn to the right and not to the left. In order to do this procedure, the rudder is held to starboard, to the right, during the entire procedure. You don't go back and forth with the rudder. You just turn it to the right and hold it there. The engine is kicked ahead and kicked in reverse repeatedly until the boat is turned. The boat turns within its length. Now, some call this procedure back and fill. We call it a standing turn, but it's the same procedure. The next diagram shows you what that procedure looks like. There's a lot of stuff on this page, but I'll go through it a piece at a time. First off, this is a sequential procedure, steps 1 through 6. And up top, you see the gray arrow refers to the direction of prop wash that you see in these diagrams. And the black arrow is the direction that the stern moves in response to the prop wash. So in diagram 1, we're in a headgear with right rudder, full right rudder. We're starting a standing turn. And if I kick ahead, full kick ahead, 3 seconds, up to 3,000 RPM, the prop wash is being deflected to the right. The stern will move actually to the left and forward from position 1 to position 2. Now come to the next diagram, and here's position 2, which is the same as this position 2. And we now go into reverse, but we keep the rudder to the right because the rudder has no effect on this procedure. And we now kick astern, full throttle in reverse, and it will now pull the stern to the left, and it's prop walk, which is pulling it to the left, and of course the prop wash, which is pulling it back. So we've now pulled the boat around to position 3, but we're pretty close to our original position here. Going to the next diagram, here's position 3, same as this one, and we again kick ahead, rudder remains in right rudder, the stern will move forward and to the left to position 4, then here's position 4, we're again in kick astern, we pull the stern to aft and to the left, we then kick ahead, and we kick astern. We've now turned the boat in a pretty much in its length, and the rudder is always to the right, and we're simply changing our throttle from kick ahead forward to kick ahead to kick in reverse. And one of the things to remember when we do this is to not jam the throttle through the neutral gear, because it can damage your transmission. You want to stop, and I'll mention this, to consciously stop in the neutral position so that you don't damage transmission. So that's a standing turn, and we use this commonly in docking procedures, either a full turn, maybe 360, or a quarter turn, or a half turn as shown here. But you want to master a standing turn. It's a vital procedure for docking a boat. The next item I want to show you is doubling a line, and this is when you're getting away from a dock and you want to bring your line with you, but you want to maintain control on a dock cleat or a dock piling, and you'll double a line like this around that piling so that you can, as you back out, in this case, you can take the line with you. So we'll refer to this in some of our procedures in a few minutes. I mentioned shifting gears. Don't jam the gears through neutral. Coordinate the gear shift and the throttle. And speak the words to yourself, forward, neutral, reverse, to make sure you make a conscious stop in neutral. Mooring lines, what we recommend is 3-strand nylon. I recommend against using braided nylon for mooring lines. They don't hand as well in your hand, and they also don't resist abrasion as well as a 3-strand nylon. And we use always nylon for docking lines because nylon line stretches. Actually, it'll stretch about 40% of its length before it will break. So 3-strand nylon is the line to use. Secondly, I recommend plain ends with a bolt and knot as needed, and avoid the use of braided loops. And the reason for this is a couple of reasons. One, when you put your loop on a piling or a cleat, there are times when someone else will come along with another boat and put their line over yours, and then you're trying to get out and they have not done it properly, and your line is locked in with a braided loop. And it's easy to untie a bowline and to just slip your line out. And the second reason is that there are a lot of procedures in which you want to pull a line through. For example, when you are doing the doubling of the line procedure that we mentioned here, if you had a loop or a knot in this end of the line, that would get in the way of pulling it off the piling. So we avoid use of braided loops. We use a bowline knot. And then there are, and we'll show these in the diagrams, there are bow lines, stern lines, a forward spring line, after spring line, and an anchor line. And I'll show you these in some of our mooring configurations. Here's a young man beginning to put a line on a cleat, and learning a cleat hitch is an important step as well. Essential knots for docking, I mentioned the cleat hitch, the bow line, as distinguished from a bow line. There's a round turn with half hitches. There's a rolling hitch, and I mentioned previously animatedknots.com for step-by-step instructions in tying these knots. And here's a cleat hitch, frequently tied incorrectly, but this shows the correct procedure for tying a cleat hitch. And this is something that you want to practice. You want to learn how to tie it from all directions. That is, you're approaching the cleat and the line from various directions, and you want to be able to tie that pretty much with your eyes closed and get it right. It's going to hold your boat, and you want it to work well. Heaving a line. This is an essential technique to learn because many times you're coming into a dock and there's a dock hand who's going to help you, and you want to heave the line to them, and there's a proper technique for doing this, and it can make a real difference between a successful and an unsuccessful docking. The details of doing this procedure are described in the docking techniques manual that I referred to that we use. So keep in mind heaving line and learn the procedure for doing that. Docking safety, I suggest you don't attempt to manhandle large boats over 28 feet because this is where injuries can come in. And by manhandling, I'm referring to pushing on the piling with your hands, putting your foot on the piling or on the dock, these are where injuries come. And we recommend that in boats, once they get up over 28 feet, they're getting heavy enough that you can sustain injuries. Now, alternatives for docking in strong wind, one is to use spring lines, and we'll go over these. A second alternative is to use a more accessible dock than you were planning to use. And thirdly is you might temporarily anchor out and just don't dock until the strong winds pass. And also for docking safety, you want to remember to always plan an escape route for all of your dockings. And we'll talk about this as we go through some of the scenarios. Crew assignments, ideally you want to have 2 deck crew. And I know people have asked us the question, well, what about single-handed? And you'll use the same procedures in single-handed, but you have to do all the jobs by one person. So you have to understand the procedures, understand the techniques, the forces that act on the boat, but one person may end up doing it. So you have to be more agile for that purpose. Dock line prep, there are the bow lines, spring lines, stern lines to prepare, bowline loops for the shore end for pilings or cleats, and no braided loops I mentioned. Have your fenders in place, plus a roving fender. Follow the skipper's instruction, and here's a vital precaution. Do not let advice from the shore counter the skipper's plan. So many times we try to come in the dock, we have a plan where all the crew members understand how we're going to dock this boat, what the procedure will be. The deck crew goes up forward, the skipper's at the helm, let's say, and someone on the dock starts shouting instructions to the bow crew about do it this way, do it that way, and the bow crew gets confused and behuddled. So my advice is ignore advice from ashore. Follow the skipper's instructions. The bow crew also wants to call out distances to the helmsman because the helmsman is a long way from the bow and does not necessarily know how far the bow is from the dock. And be alert for obstructions, other boats, and swimmers in the water. Here are some terms that I'll go through briefly, and again, these are covered in our docking techniques book. But the bitter end is the inboard end of the line, the end that you're holding. The bow line is a mooring line attached to the bow of the boat. A bowline is a knot. It's a loop tied in the end of a rope with a bowline knot. Making way refers to a boat moving through the water under some form of propulsion, whether it's motor or oars or sails, but it's making way through the water. Port side is the left side of the boat. A spring line is a mooring line leading forward or aft, usually from a midship cleat on a boat. Starboard side is the right side of a boat. Surging a line refers to temporarily ease tension on a line and allow it to slide out from a stationary object like a cleat. So if you're giving the instruction surge the line, it means to ease it out, but don't lose control of it. Turn a line means to wrap a line around a stationary object. A single turn wraps once around the object. The line is not tied or cleated to the object. The line is simply turned on the stationary object. And underway refers to a boat making way under propulsion or floating freely and not moored or anchored. A boat adrift is underway but is not making way. So you understand the difference between the distinction between underway and making way. Making way is under propulsion. Underway, it can be either under propulsion or drifting. The next thing is mooring arrangements, and I'll show you some details on these. Now, this shows a basic arrangement for mooring in a slip. And you can see that this boat here on the left has 2 bow lines. It has 2 stern lines. It has a after spring, that is a spring line that's leading aft. and it has a forward spring line, a spring line that's leading forward. And the key, in my mind, in mooring in a slip like this is to have your lines tight enough so that the boat does not ride up against the pilings when there's a weather change. If you have a tidal swing of 3 feet or less, you can generally tie your mooring lines tight and center the boat up, and the stretch in the nylon line will generally accommodate up to a 3-foot tidal swing. If you have more than 3 feet, you either have to slacken the lines, which means that if a weather change is expected, you have to come back and readjust those lines, or you're on a floating dock. But with a large tidal swing, you have to take some special precautions. But with this arrangement, if I have 3 feet or less in tidal swing, I would like to keep my lines tight so that a weather change, a strong wind coming through, will not be jamming the boat up against the pilings. This next diagram simply shows that you also have the option of crossing the stern lines, and this next diagram shows a similar arrangement with bow in first on a slip. Okay. This is one of our training boats, and this shows the stern lines being crossed at the back here. You can't see much else. Here's parallel mooring along a pier, and basically you notice that there's fenders showing. These are fenders, these are not pilings. And we have a bow line, a stern line, and we have, again, a forward spring and an after spring, and the boat is secure. Here's one of our training boats in a parallel mooring situation. If you have an arrangement where the wind is blowing strongly onto the dock, you may want to use an anchor. And I realize you may not always have the room. This may be a fairway that it's not good to put an anchor out. But if you have the ability with a strong onshore wind, an anchor is one way to protect the boat, hold it off the dock. Your line arrangement is similar, but what you're doing with the anchor is basically taking the pressure off of the boat riding up against the dock. Okay. Here's a Mediterranean moor used commonly in the Med, where dock space is at a premium. And basically, in order to accomplish this, your boat is out here. You drop your anchor out at this point. You back in on the anchor, and you tie your stern lines. Now, let's talk about the procedures for undocking a boat, that is, getting away from the dock. First off, there's pre-departure preparations. And this checklist that I'm going to go through with you here, this was also covered in detail in our training manual, if you want the details of this. But basically, you should be very thoroughly inspecting the boat. And these are just some photos showing people checking various places on the boat prior to getting underway. And it's something that you should thoroughly do on a regular basis. So a seaworthiness inspection of the boat. And for that, you generally are going to check the entire boat, first off, for Coast Guard required safety equipment, including your PFDs, that is your personal flotation devices and flares, boat documentation, your man overboard equipment, engine and transmission oil levels, your steering gear, fuel and water tank levels, your through hull valves, bilges, bilge water, electrical panel and equipment, your instruments, your nav lights, your sails, your mast, your boom, standing and running rigging, ground tackle, dock line, fenders, and the list goes on and on and on. But you want to know that your boat is ready to go to sea. You also want to check on your weather forecast, both over the VHF, maybe before you got down to the dock, you checked on the internet. When you get to your boat, check the VHF and on the NOAA channels. And if available on your boat, your Navtex receiver, which has weather forecasts on it. And I highly recommend Navtex on boats that are even sailing coastal waters. Navigation, you want to set up your plan your planned route for the day and have your routes and your charts and all of that arranged ahead of time. You want to check out your electrical system and make sure you're properly secured your 110 volt systems. You're disconnected from the dock with your electrical. You have your DC electrical system properly lined up on the boat. Your sails, you want to remove the mainsail covers, have your sails ready to deploy. You want to make duty assignments to your crew for getting underway, specific assignments for who's going to do what. Plan your departure. We're going to go out of the dock here, we're going to turn left, we're going to go out around that buoy and so forth, so that everyone on board knows what that procedure is going to be. You go through your engine startup, verify proper cooling water flow, verify that your gear shift and your throttle properly operate. And then for departure, you do a final check of your steering gear, your wind direction, and how that's going to affect your departure, traffic in the area, cast off your lines, and you motor out slowly. So you want to go through a regular pre-departure procedure before you depart. Now, here's the simplest procedure for getting underway from a parallel docking arrangement where you have favorable winds. You notice over here that here's the dock, and here you are in the center boat, and there are boats fore and aft of you, and you want to get off of this dock, and basically you disconnect your mooring lines, and you let the wind blow you out. You have the engine running, of course, before you started this, and you use short kicks of the engine, forward or reverse, to maintain position of the boat and orientation, that is the heading of the boat. Short kicks with the rudder, forward or aft, to maintain position while you're being blown out. And then you can get away from the dock when you clear those other boats. That's the simplest departure. You have another one where you have wind blowing onto the dock. And here you're being pinned against the dock with the wind. You have fore and aft boats obstructing your departure. And there are two procedures for doing this. One is stern out procedure. And as I say, you have opposing wind. You have a fender on the bow as well as back here, but the one on the bow is vitally important for this procedure. You have an after spring line from a bow cleat to back here on the dock. And what you will do is we have right rudder, and you'll power forward, and this is slow ahead, in order to turn the stern of the boat out. Now, the spring line is going to hold the boat from moving forward, but the prop wash on the rudder, of course, is going to push the stern out. And you want to have a deckhand forward with preferably a non-collapsing pole that you can use to push off the bow from the dock. So basically this is swinging the stern out and then backing out this way. Now with the wind blowing in this way, you also, once you clear the bow from the dock, you also have to worry about this boat here. So you have to be prepared to clear this boat as well, and use your pole for that. So that's the stern out procedure. The next procedure is bow out, and this is simply the opposite. And here you run your spring line from a stern cleat to a dock cleat, and you go in reverse gear. There's a fender on your stern, and the boat turns bow out now, and you can then motor out. Between the two, I personally prefer the stern out procedure, and you might practice both in order to get proficient with both and find out what you like best. So those are two for parallel undocking with opposed wind. Now, the next procedure I'd like to show is heading bow out of a slip, and you have to consider the wind in these cases. So in this arrangement that I'm showing here, here you are coming out of a slip. Here are other slips across your fairway, and you have wind blowing down the fairway, and your desired route is going out this way towards the wind. So when you do this, the wind is going to want to prevent the bow from turning at slow speeds, and you have to make provisions for that. If you have a strong enough wind, you may be blown into this dock across the way. So the use of spring lines in this case would help with this. Now this spring line is run so that the line goes from your midship cleat around the piling and back around to you're holding it on deck. Now, two things about routing this spring line. One is, notice the direction that it's wrapped. It's wrapped so that when the boat comes out, the spring line will not be crossed. It'll straighten out into two parallel lines, okay? In order to accomplish that, this bitter end of the line that you're holding in your hand has to be over top of the line of the standing part of the line going out to the piling. So this line is coming from the cleat around the piling back to you on deck over top of the standing part, and it's in your hand back here. Now as you come out, as you motor out, the person tending this line has to maintain enough tension but not cinch it up tight. You're going to surge this line in order to allow the boat to have its freedom to get away from the dock, but also you're going to be controlling the turn. This person with this spring line will control the turn more than the rudder will be controlling it at slow speeds. So this is using a spring line to turn into the wind, and then once you've done that, you rapidly pull this line in from the standing part. You have to pull it off the piling. Now, you want to make sure when you set this line up that you don't have any knots in the end of your line. You want to make sure that the line is free to run off the piling, that it's not tangled up with other lines on that piling, that it's not jammed up in one of those cleats that's on the piling to hold the line up. Okay, so you want to make sure it's going to run free from all of that stuff, because once you're to this point here, the boat is now underway. You want to get that line off that piling promptly without getting hung up, without it getting hung up on the piling. Okay, so that's heading bow out of a slip with wind opposed to the direction you're going to be turning. Now here's backing out of a slip, bow to wind. So with this arrangement, here's a slip, here's a dock here, here's a finger pier, and here's your midship piling. And what I would be doing here is using with wind opposed, and the fairway exit is to the right. So I want to come and turn my boat, the stern to the left, so that I can turn to the right and go down the fairway to the right. But I have opposing wind to that. The wind is trying to prevent me from making that turn out of the slip and going down the fairway. With this arrangement, I would use two spring lines. One is from a bow cleat coming back to this piling, and as before, it goes over the standing part, and the bitter end is held by a deck crew. The one from midship on port here is similar. It's going around the piling and back over the standing part, so that I've got control of the boat in two directions. Now this is assuming I don't have a dock hand on the dock. If I have a dock hand, I can have that dock hand handle this bow line and control the bow towards the wind as I back down. But if I don't have a dock hand, I can use the spring line, and as the boat gets to about this position, I can release that spring as shown here and gather it in. Okay? And this spring line is now controlling the turn of the boat. It's assisting the turn into the wind. so that it'll help me pull the stern around as I pull back with my engine in reverse. And once it gets to where it's about ready to clear this piling, I can release this spring line and gather it in. So there's 2 spring lines used in this operation. So that's backing out of a slip to windward, and you're trying to turn to go out towards the wind. My next operation is backing out of the slip stern to wind. So here I have the wind blowing in this direction into the slip, or in this direction, trying to prevent the boat from turning. So normally I would like to be able to just back out and make a turn here from 1 to 2 to 4. But if the wind is holding me in towards the slip, the only solution to this really is to be able to back out far enough so that I can make my turn. And here I have to promptly do possibly a portion of a standing turn in order to make this turn before I'm blown down into this piling here. And if I come here, I have a question here. What is the abort plan if it looks like you're not going to clear the piling? And if I get down here almost to position 3 and it looks like I'm not going to clear the piling, then my abort plan is going to be to back hard, and get away as far as I can, do a portion of a standing turn here, and then come on out. So this is stern to wind with an opposing wind, and I'm coming out the fairway towards the exit, and the wind is blowing from the exit. Okay, the next docking arrangement that I'd like to show, this is coming into a dock now, and this is parallel docking along a pier. And some of your pre-docking preparations, first off, there are to evaluate conditions that exist. If you have the ability to inspect this strange dock beforehand, and if you can do it by shore, before you get on your boat, that's a good thing to do, to become familiar with what's in that slip. If you can't do that, well, you're going to have to call the marina ahead of time for the dock conditions, the wind angle, and the current that may exist in the vicinity of the dock that you're going to get into. You can also do a flyby in your boat. That is, before you actually go into that slip, run by that slip, be ready to do a standing turn to get out of that fairway, and while you're doing the flyby, inspect the pilings for nails and obstructions and so forth. So these are a couple of ways in which you can evaluate conditions before actually committing to docking in that particular slip. A slip that has pilings with nails in it, I wouldn't go into it, because I mean the nails can do significant damage to your boat. Then with your pre-dock preparations, you also have to have a docking plan. Skipper decides now that he's got some information on that dock arrangement, decides on how he wants to dock, and he has to consider the slip location, the obstructions, the depths, the wind direction, and so forth. And he has to advise the crew and make assignments. And also, very importantly, for all docking procedures, you want to have an abort plan so that you don't get trapped without an escape route. And in many, many cases, this is where a standing turn to the right is going to save you, but you have to consider wind direction, obstructions, currents, other boats, and so forth. But have your docking plan prepared ahead of time so that if I'm coming into this slip and all of a sudden there's a problem, whatever, and there's not unusual to have problems, be ready to abort. And the point of aborting the docking is abort early. If you found out that you were coming into that slip and you misjudged your position, you misjudged the wind, and you feel that you're in the wrong position for getting properly into that slip, abort early and do a go around and come back again to finish your docking. So let's look at some parallel docking arrangements. First off, we're going to talk about wind blowing onto the dock, and you're going to stop parallel to the dock a few feet away, hold position with rudder and short kicks fore and aft, and allow the wind to push you toward the dock. Okay. Wind blowing off the dock, you're going to use forward spring lines for a hemmed-in dock, and you're going to use after spring lines for an open dock. And I'll show you diagrams of both of these. Now, in general, all else being equal, I would prefer to use a port side approach if possible. That is, the slip is to the port side of my boat, because this allows for better abort route and maneuvering room. But I'll show you these. So the wind blowing off the dock, this is the hardest one. Forward spring for hemmed-in dock, after spring for an open dock. So here's a hemmed-in dock, and here I want to come into this dock. Now, there's obstructions here and here. I want to get into this alcove here on this slip. And in order to do this, I want to, in advance, at position 1, here's the wind blowing off the dock. And at position 1, before position 1, I want to rig 2 spring lines, or a midship spring and a bow line. And the midship spring is going to have a bowline loop tied in the end, and it's going to be long enough to reach the bow of the boat from the midship. And the bow line is going to have a bowline loop tied, and it's going to be cleated to this bow cleat with about 6 foot of length on it. And the size of these loops depends on whether we have cleats or pilings on the dock. Obviously, the piling takes a larger loop, and you want to have a loop that's plenty big enough for that piling. And if I have a 12-inch piling, I'll generally have about a 2-foot loop in that line. I want it to be plenty big to be able to get it easily on and off that piling. So I'm going to have these lines prepared. I have a deck crew up forward. We're coming in, and remember, we have wind here opposing us. So we're going to come in, and we're going to be pointing here, and the wind is going to be blowing our bow down as we come over. So I'm going to exaggerate my heading for about this position, so that as I come in and I allow the wind to blow my bow off to the cleat on the right, and as I get in close to that, I put both of these loops, both loops on that one cleat or piling. It's easier with a piling, but you can also do it with a cleat. Once I have those on, the deck crew shouts lines on, and the helmsman then backs on the spring line. The deck crew adjusts the bow line, slacks the bow line only enough to control the bow. Remember, the wind is blowing down this way, so he's preventing the bow from blowing out here, but he does not want to be so tight as to take control from the spring line. It's the spring line that's in control, and the bow line is only preventing the bow from blowing away from the dock. And I don't care if the bow blows this far away from the dock or this far away. What I don't want it to do is turn the boat around. So the bow line is slacked enough to allow the spring line to take control. And if you look at the direction of forces here, the spring line is pulling in this direction. The prop wash is pushing forward and pulling the stern back. But the net result of those two forces is it's going to gently pull the boat in towards the dock. And you can do this at half throttle and just gradually pull in. If the wind is blowing really strong, you may have to go higher than half throttle, but rarely do you have to do that. And it's not something you have to do rapidly. You can do it. The boat is under control now. The spring line has got it. The bow line is preventing the bow from blowing away, and you're gently, gradually pulling towards the dock. Once you get that, you then get a stern line on and finish up the rest of your mooring lines once the boat is laying there against the dock. So that's with a forward spring in an obstructed dock. Now I have a second arrangement with an open dock. That is, I have the ability to come in parallel to the dock, as shown here. I have wind blowing off the dock. I'm coming in fairly parallel to the dock, and I'm going to use an after spring line on midship cleat. And as I come in near this cleat, I want to get this spring line on that cleat, and I power ahead on that spring line. I have left rudder, now not full left rudder, I have only enough left rudder to keep the boat heading parallel to the dock, and the boat will simply gently pull in towards the dock. So I use the rudder to control the direction of the boat parallel to the dock, but allow the spring to pull it over. And then once you're in, you rig your other lines, your other dock lines. So those are a couple of parallel docking arrangements. This one for a hemmed-in dock using a forward spring line and a bow line. This one for an open dock where I can come in parallel to it. Okay, the next set of procedures I'd like to talk about is docking bow into a slip. And here, the basic steps in this are you want to get a windward bow line to the dock. You have a forward deck hand to call out your bow distances because the helmsman cannot necessarily judge that from the helm. You're going to make a wide turn to the windward side of the slip to compensate for the bow blowing downwind. And I'll show you a diagram of this. Well, let me show you the diagram now. A wide turn in a crosswind. So here's my slip, here's the dock, here's my slip between the pilings, and here's the wind blowing this way, a crosswind on the slip. I want to come in wide so that I come in wide enough so that my stern is up to windward of its final position in the dock. And I actually come in pretty broad of the slip, depending on the strength of the wind, and allow the wind to pull me down. Now, even if I have to allow the bow to blow down, and even if the stern hangs back, the stern will eventually come down once I'm in here. But I want to come in broad on that slip. I do not want to come in here because I'll never get my stern in without dragging this piling. Okay? Let's go back and look at our list. So that's the concept of make a wide turn to windward of the slip. Then with an astern wind blowing into the slip, this is going to increase your boat speed and make stopping harder. You're going to be going faster than you think you are, and you have to make sure that you get your spring line on promptly to be able to stop the boat. A headwind blowing out of the slip makes control of the boat more difficult as the bow slows down to a stop. Also, the fact that if the wind is blowing from ahead and it's fickle, that is, sometimes it's blowing from your right and sometimes blowing from your left, it kind of confounds your plans for how you're going to approach that. So wind blowing out of the slip is difficult for two reasons. One, it makes control of the bow more difficult, and also it confounds your plans. And an astern wind is difficult because it speeds the boat up and has you going faster than you think you are. And a crosswind you have to compensate for in this manner. Okay, so let's talk about backing into a slip. Now, backing into a slip, there's a couple of principles to keep in mind. In all of these scenarios that I'm going to show to you, you're going to position the boat to windward of the slip and stopped with the bow angled towards the wind before you start to back in. Let's go over that again. The boat is going to be positioned windward of the slip and stopped with the bow angled toward the wind before you start to back in. Port side approach to slip is preferred over starboard side approach as it gives more maneuverability and a better abort route. And I think you'll see this as we look at these scenarios. So let's look at the first scenario of backing into a slip, port side approach. Now let's look at this whole arrangement. This is no wind in this situation. Here's the dock. Here are the pilings of the slip. And I'm going to end up here at position 4 in the slip. So I'm approaching this port side to the slip. So here's the slip, and I'm coming in from this direction, and I have my boat, the port side of my boat, facing the slip. This is the preferred if all else, if you're able to do it. So I'm going to come here, and with no wind, I'm going to make a turn roughly 45. I'm going to make this turn with a short kick ahead because I don't want to speed the boat up. But at position 1, I'm going to essentially stop the boat. I'm going to come to a full stop. Then I'm going to go right rudder, give a kick ahead to turn the boat. When I do that, it's also going to move the boat up to this position. I then begin my backing when I'm still here. I keep the rudder in right rudder. I do not change my rudder. What a lot of people will do is try to steer the boat in reverse with the rudder, but the issue is the boat is not going fast enough for the rudder to be effective in reverse. So the time it takes for you to shift the rudder right, left, you've basically lost the timing of the docking procedure. So I recommend to people to keep the rudder full to the right, start your backing, and the boat is now going to start coming back. And when you do this, the boat may, this corner of the stern may actually end up right about here. So when you're still about 2 feet from that piling, you're going to kick ahead, a full kick ahead, a hard kick ahead, full throttle, but get it off promptly. 1, 2, 3, neutral. In doing that, you're going to move the boat a little bit forward, but you're going to move the stern appreciably to the left. And you're actually going to take that kick off before the stern is where you want it to be. Because that stern is going, even when you go back to neutral, that stern is going to continue to move left because of momentum of the boat, inertia of the boat. And I now back more. And if I'm not going to clear this piling, I do another kick ahead. Whether I do a full kick or a short kick depends on how far I have to go. But basically I do another kick to clear this piling. Now once I get the starboard quarter of the stern to clear that piling, I keep backing in, even if the boat is still angled like this, or even angled more, because depth in the slip is money in the bank. The further I am into the slip, even if angled, the better off I am. So even if I come and nestle against a piling, if I've previously verified there are no nails in these pilings and I've got good rub rails on the boat, I can nestle against the piling. It's okay. But once I get into this depth, I can do another kick and straighten the boat in order to clear this next piling. So I do alternate kicks and then slow reverse, kick, slow reverse, kick, slow reverse, until I get myself angled right. While I'm doing this, once the stern is to this point, your deck crew can get a line on this piling and bring it to the bow. If it doesn't reach the bow, bring it to the midship cleat and help control the boat as you're backing in. When the boat is now far enough into the slip that you can get that line to the bow cleat, bend it around the bow cleat, and again, hold tension on it. This is just turned on the cleat, and you're pulling tension on it as the boat is backing in. Same thing is done on port side. You get both of these bow lines on, and one deck crew, once those lines are on, holds tension on those lines as the boat is backed in, and keeps pulling on those lines around these cleats. And another deck crew, if you have the luxury of two deck crew, gets another line on this piling for a spring line. So you now have two bow lines and a spring line. The spring will control the depth in the slip. And the helmsman talks to the spring line tender and tells the spring line tender when to stop the boat. When he says stop the boat, the spring line tender is going to cinch up on that spring line, cleat it, and he's going to tell the helmsman that spring line is cleated. I keep the engine in reverse, in slow reverse, to maintain tension on that spring line. What a lot of people want to do, once they have this line on and the bow line's on, they want to kill the engine. Don't do that. Keep the engine on. It maintains tension on this spring line. If you put the engine in neutral, the boat's going to walk back out of the slip because these lines are stretched and they're going to begin pulling it. So I want to keep tension on this line with engine maintained in reverse. Now adjust my bow lines to center the bow. Spring line is controlling the depth. Engine is still running and slow. The boat is very stable, and you can now step off and get your stern lines on. The stern lines are the absolute last thing that you have to worry about. And often somebody on the dock wants to be helpful, and they want to hand you your stern lines, and basically they interrupt your deck crew from doing what they should be doing. So this is one of these areas where you have to maintain a clear focus on what you're doing, and don't let somebody on the dock deter you from what you should be doing. So this is backing in, port side approach, no wind. Here's one of our classes backing into a slip. They are at this point, they're at position 2 roughly in this photograph. And here's their slip here. Their slip is here, and they're going to be backing into this slip that's going in this direction, basically. They're backing towards this piling right at this point, okay? And this deck crew is getting ready to put the bow line and the spring line on the pilings. Okay, here's backing in with the wind blowing from ahead. Now, I'm again doing port side approach. Here's the slip. I'm coming down the fairway this way. The wind is blowing from ahead. And the difference between this and the previous docking with no wind is where previously I did my turn and ended up here. I want to now be windward of the slip. You recall my rules. I want to be windward of the slip and turned. Now, depending on the strength of the wind determines how far you turn. If the wind is blowing 12 or 15 knots, I'm only going to do about a 10-degree turn because the wind is going to turn me the rest of the way as I do my backing. If I have a 5-knot wind, I might turn 30 or 40 degrees before I back in. I would rarely, with wind from ahead, turn more than 40 degrees. But basically, I want to be in this position when I start my backing in. Now the wind is going to be setting the boat down. It's going to be turning the bow and turning you towards this slip. And you may have turning your stern towards this piling. And this is now a matter of judgment and practice. But you want to end up to windward of the slip. Your deck crew is going to get this midship line on. Once they get to this piling, pull on it to help prevent the bow from blowing downwind. And one of the things that the helmsman has to do as they're backing in is pay attention to where your bow is. Now here's the only time that you may shift your rudder. If the bow does not cross the center line of the slip, I would maintain right rudder through this entire procedure. But if the helmsman sees the bow approaching center line and crossing center line of the slip, I would then immediately shift to left rudder. And here's the reason for that. If the bow is to the left, I want right rudder because my boat is going to be backing on this angle, and I'm going to I will have to be prepared to kick ahead to clear these pilings as I come in. But once the bow crosses center line, I'm now going to be backing this direction, and I want left rudder to clear these pilings. But keep in mind, once the bow crosses center line of the slip, you are approaching abort conditions. Once it crosses center line of the slip, if you don't have this line on the midship, you may have to abort, okay? Because once it crosses the center line and the wind is blowing, there's really no way to get that bow back up to windward without going hard on this piling. Okay, so this is backing in, port side approach, wind from ahead. Okay. Now here's backing in, port side approach, wind from astern. Now here's the slip. Here you are approaching the slip, your port side approach, but I've got wind in back of me trying to speed me up and blow me past that slip. So what I want to do in this case is turn the boat. Remember, I want to position the boat to windward of the slip, turn towards the wind. The only way I can do that with this approach is to do a standing turn at this point from 1 to 2 and actually turn the boat through 90 plus 45, 135 degrees or almost 180 degrees. If the wind is strong, I may have to turn the boat where I've turned, or I'm only 10 degrees off the wind if it's a strong wind. And I may have to start this turn way back here. Okay? So depending on the strength of the wind determines where you do this and determines how far you turn before you start your backing in. But what I want you to notice is the symmetry. Here's wind from astern. You end up at position 2. You're positioned to windward. The symmetry of this, with this arrangement, you're to windward of the slip where the wind was from ahead. You simply had to make a 10 or 20 or 30 degree turn. But with wind from astern, we had to turn almost completely around to have the boat in the right position to begin our backing in. Okay? So that's, otherwise, once up to this point, the procedure is the same. Now, let's look at the next arrangement where I have backing in starboard approach. I'm now approaching the slip from the starboard side. Okay? And this procedure is exactly the same as the port side approach. I'm still going to end up to windward of the slip at position 2. How far I turn depends on the strength of the wind. The only difference between this and the port side approach is that with the port side approach, I have the prop walk in reverse pulling me to the left. In this arrangement, I have the prop walk in reverse pulling me to the left also, but it's pulling me towards the slip, as opposed to the previous one is pulling me away from the slip. Okay, but otherwise this and this are very similar, except for the effects of prop walk. Okay, and then once to this point, and I get this midship line on, and I back on it, fine. The procedure is the same. Now the next procedure will stand your hair on end, because this is backing in starboard approach, wind from astern. Here's my slip. I'm approaching with wind astern. I have to end up at position 4, which is similar to position 2 in the previous procedures. But the only way I can get there is with a standing turn to the right. And here I have to do a more than a 3/4 turn in order to get in this position. Once I'm to this position 4, I can then use my midship spring and help control the bow of the boat. So let's just go back and review these 4 backing in procedures. Here's backing in, no wind. I basically made my turn, lined up with the slip, backed in. Here is wind from ahead. I came to the windward side of the slip, begin my backing. Wind from astern, I had to turn through 3/4 of a turn before the slip. And in this case, starboard approach, similar to port side approach, except for the effects of prop walk, wind from ahead. And my next one is starboard approach, wind from astern. This is the hardest of all, doing a 3/4 turn or more to start my backing in. Now, if you have really strong winds, let me mention these other wind conditions for backing in. If the wind is blowing into the slip, this is the most challenging wind condition that you can have, because as I'm backing in, I have the wind blowing into the slip. It's on my bow, and oscillations in the wind keep you guessing. In other words, I'm backing in, and for one moment the wind is on my starboard bow. The next moment it shifts to my port bow, and it has differing effect on what it does with the bow of the boat as I back into the slip. Wind blowing out of the slip while backing in is the easiest wind direction, because it weathercocks the boat to line up with the slip center line. Now, in strong winds, we'll use what I call a waterman spring line, and that is this. First off, it requires that you have a clean piling with no nails in it. It also requires that there's not another boat in this adjacent slip with their bow or stern sticking out to obstruct you. So you need the room to do this. But this is what the watermen on Chesapeake Bay commonly use to bring their fishing boats in single-handed to a dock. And they'll come in and they'll lay against this piling, put a spring line like this, hold tension on this line, and they'll be in reverse, and they'll control the tension in order to turn the boat in a controlled manner into the slip. And here's a photo of Rita doing a waterman spring line. The only thing is she has it wrapped the opposite direction. She has a line coming from the cleat around the piling, and she's pulling it this way, which is okay. The diagram here shows you on the piling and pulling it around the cleat. Either way is okay. But they're doing a waterman spring line in this arrangement. So those are methods of getting a big boat into a little slip. Now let's summarize all that we've gone through. And first off, you have to understand the forces that act on a boat during the docking procedure. Understand the effects that wind has, that current has, prop walk, prop wash, rudder action, right or left, and so forth. Learn how you can control these forces, and don't look at the wind necessarily as an enemy. The wind can actually be a benefit while you're docking if you know what it's doing and how to deal with it. You want to remain alert for the effects of the wind and the current. That is, when you're backing in, you want to pay attention to the bow of the boat. What is the bow doing at the present time? Use slow speeds during docking. Look at the bubbles in the water. Make sure you know whether or not the boat is stopped or whether it still has way on. And as I say, pay attention to your bow. And practice, practice, practice. Now, if you practice, 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 and you get that big boat into a little slip, you're going to be happy, happy, happy at the results. So these two ladies just backed this boat in, and they're very happy about the whole thing.